Mm, We are going to be live, Melanie. All right. Well, I'll give you 1 second as we're just finishing setup here. Melanie, it is wonderful having you to talk to you this morning. We're already live. We're going to start talking in a second. And here we go. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, Melanie Phillips. A pleasure having you. We were live last week. We were live last week talking, and it was right with the headline news of Tommy Robinson. And we were getting a lot of feedback, a lot of comments from your fan base, from your readership, wanting to hear from you what you have to say about this whole Tommy Robinson episode. So would love to hear your 2 cents on this, Melanie.
Thank you. Hello, Amy. Hello from London, where the sun is shining. Yes, to everybody, hello. Thanks for joining us again. I realized from all the comments last week that people were very frustrated that I wasn't speaking about the Tommy Robinson affair. And I'm afraid I'm going to frustrate you again this week for reasons I will now explain. I have, in the interim period, in the last few days, posted something on my website, melaniephillips.com, a comment about the Tommy Robinson furore. But it's a limited comment because the reason why I and others couldn't speak or write about it was that there were very heavy reporting restrictions on what journalists can say about this. And these reporting restrictions were only partially lifted a few days ago. And when they were partially lifted, I wrote what I considered to be legally safe about it. And I'm afraid I can really add no more at the moment. The legal proceedings, the criminal proceedings are still going on. And until they finish, reporting restrictions will not be completely lifted. So I can't add very much more to what I've already written as of today until reporting restrictions are lifted. And as soon as they are, I will make a further comment and hopefully explain in greater detail why I've taken the position I have and why others have taken the position that they have. So I apologize again, but patience, please.
As an avid fan reader of yours, Melanie, I sense the frustration waiting to hear what you have to say on this. This is such headline news today. But thank you for that clarification. Hopefully everyone can internalize that. All right, so let's move on to other issues today. We can't talk about Tommy yet. Recently, again, Israel is in the headline news because Hamas shooting rocket attacks, the violent riots taking place. And recently there were some British Jews, I think in London, who had a prayer service saying special Jewish prayers mourning for the Hamas terrorists. As a Jew, as a human being who understands reality, who understands the truth of the situation, it makes me infuriating to hear of a person, especially a Jew, sympathizing and saying a mourner's prayer for terrorists and terrorist sympathizers who are trying to kill us. What do you have to say? This is something that just took place in London. We'd love to hear your insight.
Well, what actually happened was on the day that there was the most violence at the Gaza border, when Israel was getting criticized, a prayer service was took place just opposite the Houses of Parliament by about, I don't know, 20, 30 youngish Jews who proceeded to say Kaddish for those who had died. And this was even though a short while before it had been revealed by the Hamas that the vast majority of those who were killed were in fact Hamas. They were not, as had been so falsely led to believe by all the Western reporting, they were not unarmed combatants who had been killed. Nevertheless, the Kaddish went ahead. And many, many Jews, including myself, found this one of the most distressing and tragic spectacles that we have seen, because it seems so completely wrong on every possible, in every possible respect. First of all, so profoundly wrong-headed in that these people were not innocent victims. They were people trying to kill Israelis, and they had been killed as a legitimate act of self-defense by Israel. The, um, the animus, the unthinking, malicious animus against Israel exhibited by such a demonstration was very, very upsetting that it was conducted by Jews. And also to use the Kaddish prayer, which is actually, as many people will know, not actually a prayer of mourning as such. It is actually a prayer of praise for the Almighty. And it is said when people die, because it is the great strength of Judaism that at that point of terrible grief, you nevertheless say, great praise to the Almighty. But nevertheless, it is a prayer associated very heavily with grief, with mourning, with bereavement. And consequently, to recite that prayer on the death of the enemies of the Jewish people, enemies who had been engaged actively in trying to attack Israel and to murder Jews, was one of the most upsetting things I have seen for a very, very long time. And it upset a lot of Jews. And there was a lot of very intemperate criticism. These Jews who took part in this service were called capos. That's the Jews who collaborated with the Nazis. A very, very offensive phrase indeed. And not even appropriate, since Jews' activities during the Nazi period in collaboration was done under duress. And you could say that these people were not acting under duress. And so from that point of view alone, it is not right and it's not accurate to call them capos, but nevertheless, very insulting. And others rained down on them every possible insult, traitor, betrayer, and so on. Now, the emotion behind those attacks, I fully understand. But I do think that that language is not appropriate for any sort of discourse. And a couple of people have objected. One in particular, a Reform rabbi, Rabbi Laura Jenner Klausner, who said or wrote that she thought this was completely inappropriate and that we should all refrain from such nasty speech. And I agree with that, except that I would have preferred Rabbi Jenner Klausner and others making a similar comment to have criticized those who took part in this demonstration, this recital of the Kaddish, because to have a situation where the only people being criticized are those who are insulting the Kaddish reciters, but they are not at the same time criticizing the Kaddish reciters themselves, seems to me unbalanced and wrong. It's very difficult in these circumstances, I think, where emotions on all sides are so high, to achieve the right kind of civilized discourse. And I think one of the things I would also say is that however shocked and distraught I was to see this scene of the Kaddish saying on behalf of the Hamas terrorists, it's important, nevertheless, to understand that for many, if not most, of those young people, those young Jews saying this, doing this, taking part in this demonstration, however hard you may find it to believe this, they themselves are in their own minds upholding Judaism and, in some cases, at the very least, demonstrating in their own way support for the state of Israel. Now, I'm sure many people will find all that completely incomprehensible, but nevertheless, that's what's in their minds. And so it's even more important, I think, to be calm in reaction to this and to try to find a way of explaining not just to the people who took part in this particular demonstration in Parliament, outside the House of Parliament, but to all those unfortunately rapidly increasing numbers of young Jews in Britain and in America in particular, who really think that by denouncing Israel in terms provided for them by the enemies of Israel and the Jewish people, those young Jews think that they are actually upholding Jewish values. Now, that says to me that something has gone dreadfully wrong with the way in which we are bringing up so many young people in the Jewish community, the way in which we are failing to imbue them with true Jewish values so that they can listen to Hamas propaganda recycled by the Western media and so forth. And these young Jews can hear this propaganda and not have the resources in themselves to understand that what they're hearing is not just lies, it's not just falsehoods, but is actually directed against their own people in the most and annihilating way. And this is happening all the time now, particularly in America, but also it's increasing in Britain as well. That our young Jewish people are just not being equipped with the, I would say, intellectual and moral resilience that will enable them to reject these defamatory falsehoods and these incendiary lies, which are intended to hurt and destroy Israel and the Jewish people, and instead to internalize them grotesquely as something that actually expresses Jewish values. And this is the conversation we should be having now in our wider Jewish community. How do we deal with this problem? How has it arisen? What's going wrong here? Where is the lack? Where is the absence? What are we teaching or not teaching that we should be doing something differently from? This is the conversation we should be having. And in order to have that conversation, we must not resort to these kind of crude insults and character assassinations, because first of all, it's unpleasant and nobody should have that sort of discourse. And secondly, it's going to be completely counterproductive because this is a major problem with which we have to deal as a matter of urgency.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Melanie. This same issue that you're talking about right now, dealing with those British Jews who said that that prayer for the Hamas terrorists. You also wrote an article recently dealing about Hamas and how the Western world and the Western media similarly is looking at the Hamas propaganda and swallowing it hook, line, and sinker and writing about it.
Well, that's absolutely right. And the media has been doing that for a long time. I mean, basically, the media has swallowed the whole Palestinian narrative, hook, line, and sinker. The Palestinian narrative being that the original indigenous inhabitants of Israel were the Palestinian Muslims going back to time immemorial, and that the Jews were only shoved into Israel as a result of the Holocaust. They came from Europe. They had nothing to do with the Middle East. And when they arrived, they displaced the indigenous people, the Muslims, the Palestinian Muslims, who were then shoved into refugee camps where Israel is making their lives as much of misery as possible in Gaza and elsewhere. That's the narrative that's been put over. And consequently, and of course, every single part of that is false. People in Britain have absolutely no idea that the only people for whom Israel, the land of Israel, was ever their national kingdom were the Jews, that the Jews are the only extant indigenous people of the land, that the real colonizers are the Arabs, and so forth and so on. Nobody has any idea about any of that. So it's not surprising that when Hamas come along with their narrative, with their story, it was more than a narrative, it's more a kind of staged series of tableaux that they put on for the benefit of the Western cameras, The story being that these are unarmed protesters, as if they're all sort of, walking around in, outside Parliament Square, just protesting with banners. These are unarmed protesters at the Gaza border who are being mown down, defenseless as they are, by the Israeli army. Whereas the truth of it is that the Hamas were putting civilians in the front line, including young people and even children, in order to produce the casualties, in order to produce precisely the kind of coverage that the Western media then produced, that these people were being mown down. Because behind them were the Hamas. The Hamas were with their wire cutters to cut the fence, and the Hamas were armed with a whole range of arms, IEDs, Molotov cocktails, some firearms, and incendiary kites that they are still sending over to Israel, causing conflagrations of Israeli farmland. By no stretch of the imagination could this be considered a peaceful protest. It was an armed invasion in which civilians were being deployed as cannon fodder. In other words, Hamas committed war crimes for which they should be arraigned as war criminals. Now, the media bought this hook, line, and sinker because the media is primed to think of Israel as the aggressor in the region, as the unlawful and unethical occupier in the region. And consequently, it sees no reason to even question the story that Hamas is putting before it, because that's the story everybody wants, and that's the story that Hamas is delivering to them. And so, as I wrote on my website, melaniephillips.com, to me, the Western media putting over this story, this completely false story, to the watching Western public. The media are accessories to the attempt at mass murder, and the attempt at mass murder of Jews, and they are accessories to the killing of those people, whether or not they are Hamas or civilians. The fact that those people have been killed by the Israelis is precisely the outcome that Hamas intended by staging its Gaza border protests in the way that it did. It did it solely to get the coverage in the Western media of, quotes, unarmed Palestinians being mown down by brutal Israeli soldiers. And so in delivering that coverage, the Western media is an accessory to Hamas war crimes and to the deaths of all those individuals, and to the intention to slaughter Jews in Israel. That's what the Western media is up to.
Unbelievable. All right, well, let's go from the Western media, let's go back to Britain and the Labour Party, because once again we have headlines of the growing anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. This anti-Semitism in the Labour Party is just, what do you have to say? It's not going away. I don't know whether it's not going away, whether it's growing, this issue. What's your insights?
The problem of Labour Party anti-Semitism certainly has not gone away, and it remains unaddressed. The situation is that, as far as I can read it, Jeremy Corbyn, the far-left leader of the Labour Party, who has never personally done enough to get rid of anti-Semitism in the party, largely because he refuses to accept that there is a link between the fundamental anti-Israelism in his party and anti-Semitism. And that's because he himself is fundamentally anti-Israel. Because of the tremendous furore, I believe he has kind of given an instruction to kind of shut the thing down as far as you can, as fast as possible. And consequently, one might expect to see a little bit of progress here and there, but really just round the edges, tinkering round the edges, because he himself is the problem. It's not the people who are coming out with all this stuff who are the essence of the problem. The essence of the problem is he himself and his attitudes. Now, people have been very careful, and I've been very careful, not to ascribe to him personally any anti-Semitic intention. And that's because, in my view, you have to be very careful before you accuse somebody of being an anti-Semite. There are some people who make it absolutely plain that they are, and that's fair enough. But others who shelter behind this anti-Israelism, you have to be very careful because they may simply be subscribing to a point of view, anti-Israelism, which in my view is fundamentally anti-Jew, but nevertheless, in their own minds, they're not anti-Jew. And I think you have to be quite careful, very careful, before peering into the souls of other people. Now, into this maelstrom has jumped the outgoing president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, the sort of leader of the Jewish community in Britain, who has said that in an interview with a newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, he said, I'm just trying to find the actual quote so I don't misquote him. He told the newspaper that Mr. Corbyn, quote, has views which are anti-Semitic and he has problematic views. He said he asked the Labour leader, he asked Jeremy Corbyn when he met him, Arkush said to him, why is there nothing good you can say about Israel? And he couldn't answer. He was silent. He has never disavowed, Mr. Arkush added, delegitimizing the state of Israel is anti-Semitic. He was chairman of Stop the War, which is responsible for some of the worst anti-Israel discourse. He's never disavowed that sentiment. Is this doublespeak? What are we supposed to think? If he shares the prevalent discourse about Israel, then that view is unquestionably anti-Semitic. As a result, Mr. Corbyn's office has sort of gone ballistic and said, you know, he's not an anti-Semite. And others have jumped up and down. And others have expressed a concern that Mr. Arkush has gone too far in making this very personal accusation of anti-Semitism against Jeremy Corbyn. And I think Jonathan Arkush did step over a line which is, I think, a line that should be drawn, and which I'm careful to draw, between, as I said before, the discourse, the anti-Israelism. Jonathan Arkush is entirely correct to say the prevalent discourse about Israel is unquestionably anti-Semitic. It is. But I would say that it's still possible, and I know people like this, it's still possible to subscribe to that discourse about Israel. You believe Israel is illegitimate. You believe Israel shouldn't exist. You believe that it was a mistake that it was set up in the first place. Now, I would say that is fundamentally anti-Judaism because, you know, Israel and Zionism is simply the expression of the will to self-determination of the Jewish people, and Israel is the realization of the self-determination of the Jewish people as a nation in its own homeland. So that is fundamentally anti-Judaism. I would certainly say that. But I would also say that there are people who I would not describe as anti-Semitic because they subscribe to that, because they themselves don't have anything against Jews as people. And if you explain to them that Israel is actually central to Judaism, they will fight that interpretation. But if you're actually able to persuade them of that interpretation, they will say, oh, well, now I get it. Now I understand. And actually, what I really object to is the policies of the state of Israel. That's fine. That's different. So these are fine distinctions. Personally, I think they're important. Jonathan Arkush has clearly come to the conclusion that they are not relevant. And, you know, he's looked at Jeremy Corbyn across the table and he's come to this conclusion. And as a result, the situation has sort of, you know, lurched now into another stage of unpleasantness. Looking at it objectively, stepping back from the Arkush wrinkle to all this, nothing good is going to come of this situation. The situation between the situation insofar as the Jewish community in Britain is concerned and the Labour Party is simply not going to be repaired, in my view. Certainly not as long as Jeremy Corbyn is leader of the party, because it is not possible for this gulf now to be bridged. It's not possible for the party leadership to be able to deal with the anti-Israelism, which is fundamentally anti-Jew. They just can't do it. They will not do it. The interesting question to me, which is at the moment an academic question, because Jeremy Corbyn is, he's there for the duration. We don't know whether he's, there's no sign he's about to be removed. But the interesting question to me, which is academic, is if he were to be removed, would the situation, go back to something approaching a livable position? Would Jews again be able to be comfortable in the Labour Party? And I would say that for many years, I would personally think it was very uncomfortable for any Jew who really understood Israel's position and had a fair-minded understanding of the history and the present realities. It's very difficult for a Jew to be on the left at all in those circumstances in Britain, because the left in the West has overwhelmingly subscribed as its default position to anti-Israelism. The left overall has adopted Palestinianism as its poster cause, its cause of conscience. And to me, and to many other Jews, Palestinianism is a fiction. Palestinian national identity is a fiction which was invented solely to destroy the legitimate claim of the Jews to the land of Israel. And if you believe that, you cannot, in all conscience, remain a subscriber to leftism, while leftism subscribes to Palestinianism and the implicit agenda of the destruction of Jewish national identity in the state of Israel. And so, that's what I think about Jews on the left, and why the left in general poses such a terrible existential challenge, not just to Israel, but to Jewish national identity, and why I think that it's inherently problematic, even if Jeremy Corbyn were to lock tomorrow. The idea that the Labour Party could again be a party where Jews who care about Zionism, Jewish national identity, the state of Israel, and all that, I think it would be very difficult still for Jews to feel comfortable in the Labour Party.
Got it. Wow, that's a sad thought to think about. Unfortunate, I think, both for British Jewry and for Britain itself as well. Let's little time left. Last issue want to bring up, and again we're going to Europe this week. The news is that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is having a trip to visit European leaders. I think Merkel in Germany, Macron in France, and May in England specifically, to bring up and talk about the Iran issue. Any insight on what headlines we're going to be seeing after those meetings this week?
I have no insight into what Mr. Netanyahu will be saying or how these three esteemed individuals will be responding. But I can say what I think about their current position, which is that it is morally and politically, it's morally unconscionable and politically questionable. Morally unconscionable because all three basically are wedded to the terrible Iran deal, and they are wedded even more to the trade with Iran that the relief of sanctions in the wake of that deal has enabled them to have. And Mr. Netanyahu, I'm sure, is coming to try and persuade them that in the light of President Trump's decision to abrogate the deal as far as America is concerned, and to impose eye-watering sanctions, and beyond that, as Secretary of State Pompeo said in his very striking remarks a few days ago, the agenda for America now is not simply to stop Iran's nuclear ambitions. It is basically to defang the regime completely. The regime must abandon, in Pompeo's terms, abandon its support for terror organizations such as the Hezbollah, such as the Hamas. It must abandon its support for international terrorism. It must abandon its ballistic missile program. In other words, it must abandon itself. And, hooray for Mr. Pompeo. for saying that, because that is indeed the problem. The problem is not simply Iran's nuclear bomb. The problem is the regime. The regime has to go. And let's hope that America's stance will now provide those exceptionally brave Iranian people who continue to demonstrate against the regime, but who need to know that the West is going to support them in risking their lives against the regime in these protests. Let's hope that America's new policy towards Iran will enable those people to rise up in such number and with such effect that the regime is brought down, because the regime can be brought down if enough people bring it down. That's where the West should be united. That's where Britain, Germany, and France should be backing America to the hilt in getting rid of this terrible regime, which, apart from posing such a threat to Israel, apart from posing such a threat to the entire civilized world, is busily incarcerating, executing, and oppressing its own people in large measure. So the idea that Britain, France, and Germany are now at this moment aligned with the Iranian regime against America, Israel, the Gulf states, and the Iranian people in trying to get rid of this regime is morally unconscionable. And it's politically stupid, because here you have a situation where Britain, as we know, is leaving the European Union, and in those circumstances, it desperately needs trade with others, particularly trade with America. The European Union itself is in desperate situation. It needs to trade with America. At the moment, Britain, Germany, and France and the European Union seem to believe that they can continue to trade with America while continuing to trade with Iran. And what Mr. Trump has said, and they don't seem to have got the message, is that you have to choose. Either you continue to trade with Iran or you trade with America. Now, they haven't got the message yet, and they still want to continue to trade with Iran, and they still want to continue with the Iranian nuclear deal. They're still talking to Iran about terms in which they can continue this deal. Into this situation comes Mr. Netanyahu. What's he going to tell Britain, France, and America? I do not know. But I would imagine that he will draw their attention to their own national interest in continuing this morally unconscionable policy of supporting the Iranian regime. In other words, they will need to realize that they need America, Israel, the Gulf states, more than they need the Republic, the Islamic Republic of Iran. But who knows? The reason that they are supporting the Iran deal, I can only now speak for Britain, which I observed at close quarters. The reason Britain was such an enthusiast with the Iran deal was not simply, in my view, in terms of the trade that it would unlock, although that was a very significant reason, obviously. It was more profound and more worrying than that. They really did think that by making this deal, they would empower reformist elements in the regime to curb Iranian nuclear ambitions and Iranian nuclear terrorist ambitions. They really believed that. And this was such a terrible mistake, because President Rouhani, being as he is, and I don't think he's the reformer he's cracked up to be, but put that to one side, he's irrelevant. The only person who matters in the Iranian regime is the supreme leader. And the supreme leader is beyond negotiation. He is a religious fanatic. And so that was wrong on that score alone. But you know what that said to me was this terrible misapprehension under which the entire West, or Western politicians and intellectual class, labors. And that is this, that they believe that everyone in the world is a rational actor who is susceptible to claims to their own material well-being and self-interest. And therefore the West cannot, just cannot deal with a real religious fanatic who is impelled to act in the way that he does, not by material self-interest, not even by the interest of protecting his own people. He, in his own mind, is doing the will of God. And there is no argument that can be had against that. In other words, you cannot negotiate with such a regime. You cannot negotiate with such a person. All you can do is defeat them. And that's something the West can't do. The West doesn't believe in victory and defeat. The West doesn't believe in making a just war. The West believes that every problem is capable of a solution which can be negotiated round a table by people exercising reason and cracking heads together, and in everyone's own self-interest, they will come to a negotiated compromise. That's the article of faith in the West. That, in my view, is why Britain, France, and Germany are so wedded to the Iran deal, over and above their material interest in continuing to trade. That is why Mr. Netanyahu will almost certainly not succeed in his quest to bring them online. And at the end of the day, it may well be that self-interest wins, that the threat from the implicit threat from President Trump, either you trade with America or you trade with Iran, they will finally realize that is actually a true threat, that they do have to choose. It is a real choice, in which case their philosophical enthusiasm for the principle of negotiation at all costs may find that it meets the ultimate roadblock, because they can't allow themselves to go bankrupt by supporting Iran. Who knows? I don't know what's going to happen, but that's how I see the current situation.
Well, Melanie, always a pleasure hearing your insights. Thank you very, very much once again for your time, for your insights. Anyone who has not yet subscribed to Melanie Phillips, go to melaniephillips.com, sign up for a newsletter, get the information straight from Melanie herself. And Melanie, thank you once again.
Thank you, Avi, as ever, and thank you everybody for watching and listening.